Welcome to another episode of our video series of the philosophical history with contemporary critique.
Hello. Great to be back. I think we've got a pretty serious intellectual workout planned for today.
Absolutely, I'm doing well, thank you. And yeah, I'm ready for it. You know, we spend so much time digging into specific systems, but today feels different. We're asking something much more fundamental, a question for anyone trying to learn, really. What does it actually mean to know philosophy? And maybe more importantly, how has the definition of that whole pursuit just completely changed from, say, the certainties of antiquity to our very fragmented digital world?
That's the whole mission today. We're really looking at the philosophical path itself, the huge commitment it takes, and we're going to chart its transformation.
Okay.
We'll start with its deep connection to pure reason, what the ancients called logos, and then we'll jump to the huge critiques in the 20th century that basically argued for a complete divorce from that kind of rational inquiry.
So a journey from a universal, maybe undeniable truth to something more like subjective, individual stories.
Exactly. That's the arc.
That sounds like a pretty demanding path. So let's start with that burden. If someone says they have authority in this field, what does that actually mean? I mean, how long until you can say you've really mastered philosophy?
Yeah, that's the big question. It's definitely not measured in semesters. I think the consensus, if you talk to people who dedicated their lives to it, is that an undergraduate degree, 4 or 5 years, it gives you a foundation, but the common term is a half-baked understanding.
Okay, so that's just the starting point.
It is. To get to what you might call functional expertise, where you can really navigate the texts, understand the arguments, maybe contribute something new, you're looking at 8 to 10 years of just intense study, usually ending with a big doctoral thesis.
Wow. 8 to 10 years just to be competent enough to even enter the conversation.
Precisely. That decade lets you, absorb the history, the names, the vocabulary, the main arguments. But mastery, that's a whole other thing.
And what is that?
It's the ability to connect all that dense technical stuff to the messy reality of human life, to integrate it into culture. That is so much harder than just analysis. It requires real synthesis.
That makes so much sense. It explains why you so often see the really great, defining philosophical works published so late in their authors' lives.
Exactly. They need those decades of just living with the ideas for them to ripen.
Because the questions aren't just academic puzzles.
Not at all. They're existential. And that brings us right to the core task of philosophy itself, which is really about the investigation, the questioning of our basic assumptions.
And these assumptions are often, they're invisible to us, right? They just run in the background, structuring how we act, how we think.
Completely. They're implicit. The background architecture of our culture. The idea that progress is always linear or that something's value is only measured by how useful it is. The second you start to question the pillars that those assumptions rest on.
The moment you step outside the system and look back at the rules.
That's when you're doing philosophy. And it's deeply personal. It's about looking at the hidden pillars of how you live your life.
Let's make this concrete, give it some weight. I'm thinking of that moment in ancient thought where they showed that pure reason could just override common sense. Like that simple mathematical idea, the paradox, that any line, a meter, a centimeter, it doesn't matter. It contains infinite points.
That is the perfect gateway, because that abstract little fact leads you straight into the power of reason, which is just perfectly shown by Zeno's paradoxes.
The famous arrow argument.
Exactly. To hit its target, the arrow first has to go half the distance, right? And then half of what's left and half of that. On and on, forever. So Zeno says it never actually moves.
And this is where the fight starts for anyone listening, because you can see the arrow hit the target. Everything in reality screams that Zeno is wrong.
It does.
But the steps in his logic, they seem undeniable based on his premises.
It's the ultimate intellectual challenge. Zeno's claim that movement is an illusion. I mean, it's the exact opposite of what our eyes, our memory, our whole body is telling us. But he offers a proof based only on logic.
So if we can rationally prove something that completely contradicts our entire sensory experience, that implies we have some kind of power inside us that stands apart from our senses.
That is pure reason. What Zeno's argument shows is that reason has, let's call it a veto power over what our senses tell us.
A veto power, I like that.
The logical mind overrides the evidence, and this becomes the cornerstone for classical philosophy, especially for Parmenides, who was Zeno's teacher.
I can imagine a lot of people hearing that and thinking, come on, isn't that just sophistry? tricky word games.
And it's so important to see that it's not. This wasn't just idle chatter for them. Zeno and Parmenides were deadly serious. They presented a world defined by reason that our instincts just completely reject.
So you have to make a choice.
You have to. If you don't accept Zeno's conclusion, you are intellectually obligated to show where he went wrong. Is a premise bad? Is the inference invalid? You can't just wave it away. The logic demands an answer.
And the really radical implication here is that if Zeno is right, if change is an illusion, then there must be some fundamental unchanging reality, the thing in itself. And that has to be absolutely true.
Precisely. And the shock is realizing you can get access to that absolute reality, not through some mystical vision, but through the active shared use of pure reason. It's universal. If you get the terms, you have to accept the conclusion.
That idea alone, finding an absolute undeniable truth through just rational effort, it's incredibly unifying. It creates a common ground for thought that should, in theory, go beyond any culture or geography.
It created the ultimate anchor point. Existence is one, it's immovable, and it's accessible through a logic we all share. And that idea of rational certainty, well, it was the blueprint for the next 2,000 years, right up to the Enlightenment.
Right. Enlightenment thinkers totally inherited that confidence, that reason could solve everything.
Yes, that it could fix social problems, reveal universal moral laws.
But that celebration of reason, it ran headfirst into the catastrophes of the 20th century. So let's make that jump. After the sheer destruction of World War I, that whole view of reason as this inherently good progressive force, it just began to collapse.
It collapsed under a massive, sustained critique. You have thinkers starting in the 20s and then really accelerating after World War II. People like Foucault, Derrida, who just started systematically taking that Enlightenment project apart.
And what were the charges?
The charges were heavy, that reason wasn't neutral, that it was one-sided, that it was separated from the body, divorced from its environment and its context.
And what was the main indictment against it?
The central charge was that this pure objective reason had been used historically as the framework to justify oppression.
How so?
The argument was that things like scientific management or bureaucratic efficiency or even colonial rationalization, they were all rooted in a single privileged way of thinking that just excluded or even destroyed other ways of life.
So if that universal tool, that anchor point Zeno gave us, was basically thrown out, what did this post-rational movement offer as an alternative?
Well, the focus shifted dramatically, away from premises and logic and toward lived experience, specifically toward narrative and storytelling. The whole conceptual debate was sort of set aside.
In favor of what?
In favor of individual accounts. The new ethos became, everyone has a story and the subjective truth in that story is valid.
And while that might sound like a retreat from objective truth, I know that shift was also absolutely necessary. It opened the door for groups who had been silenced for centuries.
It was a monumental and positive shift toward justice. It meant that marginalized groups, especially over the last 70 years, could finally tell their stories. They could expose historical wrongs and give a voice to people who had been ignored or suppressed by that centralized institutional reason.
But this introduces the huge philosophical risk that we're all living with right now. If every person's story is equally true and valid, have we lost any kind of shared universal ground, or are we just left with total subjectivity?
That is the essential dilemma. If there's no anchor point, the only things left to connect us are maybe shared feelings or shared grievances, not shared understanding. And this whole uncertainty is being put on steroids by the digital age.
Yeah. The 20th century was the crisis of reason. The internet feels like the crisis of truth itself. So how does philosophy even operate on this digital frontier?
I often call the current environment the Wild West, or maybe a better metaphor is outer space. We're in a state with no gravity, no stable direction, because the old gatekeepers of truth institutions, editors, universities, they've been totally disrupted.
The internet basically democratized writing.
And distribution. For the first time ever, the general public can write something, send it out, and have it compete with the writing of established elites on the very same platform, at the same perceived level of authority.
And this explosion of people's writing is what's fueling populism.
It's one of the main drivers, and it is the major intellectual challenge of our time. How do you negotiate a shared reality when everyone is an author and a publisher?
And the postmodern thought that laid the groundwork for this, it didn't just stop with modern reason. It went all the way back to the source, right? To ancient Greece to Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle.
Exactly. The critique was that those three basically built the conceptual house that all subsequent Western power structures lived in. And as a result, a lot of modern scholarship has either sidelined them or reread them very critically. And this led to a new appreciation for their rivals, the Sophists.
Why are the Sophists suddenly so relevant again?
Because the Sophists, unlike Plato, they cared about rhetoric, persuasion, the power of language to construct a reality, not discover some external universal truth.
Sounds a lot like our current world.
It sounds a lot like social media. In a world of competing narratives and platform politics, the Sophists, who could argue any side of any issue, suddenly look a lot more interesting than the guys looking for a fixed, absolute truth.
That critique also pushed for a much-needed diversification of philosophy, right?
Right.
Challenging that old Eurocentrism.
Absolutely. The question became, why are we only talking about ancient Greece? What about China? What about Islamic scholarship? What about indigenous traditions?
And that's been one of the most productive changes.
Without a doubt. Over the last 70 years, scholars have actively been looking for philosophy wherever you can find it. It's definitively broken that narrow European-centric story of how reason developed.
So if you take all of this, Zeno's demand for the absolute and the total noise of today, what's the philosophical task for us right now?
I think we're living in a time where the main task is to accept the existence of what is this overwhelming, contradictory flow of information, and to do it with a kind of intellectual grace.
What does that mean?
It means resisting the urge to immediately judge or categorize or dismiss everything you see, and instead to really focus on experiencing and analyzing the information without jumping to the easy binary of absolute truth versus total lie.
Wow. That's a monumental sweep of history we've just covered.
Yeah.
We started with Zeno and this unwavering belief in an absolute universal truth you could find with reason. Then we traveled through the total fragmentation of that idea in the 20th century, and we've landed in our chaotic but also democratized digital world.
And that core tension we started with, between the absolute and the subjective, it's never gone away. The radical claim from Zeno and Parmenides that existence is one, immovable, and only accessible through reason, that point rejects all compromise. It demands a universal ground.
Which is exactly what the critics of reason reject.
Yeah.
So, for you, listening to this and trying to navigate it all, the core tension is still there. Do you believe your rational mind can access an absolute, undeniable reality like Zeno did?
Or do you believe that reality is inherently subjective, and it's tied to individual stories, to cultures, to identities? That is the philosophical choice you make every time you process a piece of information online today.
The choice between the anchor point of pure logic and the fluid world of narrative.
That's it.
Before we go, I just want to touch on one last thing, a curious detail about how all this gets passed down through translation. Even just the names we use can completely change how we see an idea's origin.
Oh, that's a fascinating and universal problem. I mean, think about just one key term, like reason, being translated from Greek into Latin, then into Arabic, and then into modern English.
Each step changes it.
Each language brings its own intellectual baggage, its own layers of meaning. The term means something different if it's being translated by a Greek Stoic, an Arabic scholar, or German idealist. These choices are never neutral. They literally shape the history of ideas we inherit.
So even just naming a philosopher or a concept means we're tapping into a long line of interpretive decisions made centuries before us.
Precisely. The names we use are themselves historical artifacts. They point back to these moments where scholars tried to standardize or recenter an idea for a new audience. It just shows you how fragile even the most established historical facts can be.
That's fascinating. Well, thank you for guiding us through this immense journey today, from the sheer commitment it takes to study philosophy to the challenges of our digital cosmos.
My pleasure. Thank you for the questions.
And thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time.